Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. Before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little community connect across continents and time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Hygiene is one of those quietly human subjects that says more about a society than any royal decree or famous battle. Because the truth is, armies may clash, kings may plot, churches may thunder, but everybody still has to deal with sweat, dirt, and smells. So what was it like, exactly, to stay clean in the Middle Ages? The short answer, not the way you'd want. The long answer, well, that's what tonight is about. In the early Middle Ages, people still bathed with some regularity. Public bathhouses existed, much like Roman traditions they inherited. Imagine walking into one of these places, a steamy, communal chamber, hot water sloshing, the occasional dice game being played in a corner. For a moment, it almost feels modern, a spa with fewer cucumbers on the eyes and more shouting over ale. But as centuries ticked by, attitudes shifted. By the later Middle Ages, bathing started to fall out of favor. Doctors warned that hot water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. Priests warned that too much pleasure in warm water might tempt the flesh into sin. The result? A world where dirt became almost fashionable. Of course, people didn't completely give up washing. Nobles might still indulge in the occasional bath, scented with herbs, roses, or lavender. Peasants, on the other hand, might not see a proper tub for months, unless you count standing in the rain as a form of divine shower. For many, the bath was reduced to a sponge dip, a rag dipped in water, briskly rubbed over the skin, then wrung out again. Think of it as the medieval version of a baby wipe, only without the soothing aloe. Hair, too, presented challenges. Lye soap could be used, a harsh mixture of animal fat and ash that left hair stiff and squeaky. For those with a bit more coin, egg yolks were sometimes beaten into a kind of shampoo. Can you imagine working up a lather on your scalp with scrambled breakfast ingredients, praying it rinses out before the yolk bakes in the sun? Not exactly salon luxury. Dental care? Ah, yes, the eternal question of what to do about your teeth when toothpaste has yet to be invented. The answer was rags dipped in salt, rough chewing sticks, or home-brewed pastes of crushed herbs and ashes. Some recipes even included honey, which sounds pleasant until you remember sugar is the main culprit for decay. In other words, medieval dental care was a bit like fighting fire with lighter fluid. The results? A lot of toothaches, and not many smiles in portraiture. But let's get real. When we picture medieval Europe, we picture the smell. And not without reason. Imagine stepping into a crowded town square on market day. The air is thick, livestock sweat, leather tanning, smoke from hearths, and somewhere beneath it all, human bodies that haven't known a proper bath in weeks. To cope, people relied on perfume and pomanders, little scented balls of herbs carried around the neck or waist. Essentially, a medieval Glade plug-in you wore like jewelry. If you couldn't smell good, you could at least smell different. Deodorant, in the modern sense, didn't exist. But alum crystals, crushed herbs, and even vinegar were rubbed under the arms to keep odors at bay. Linen undergarments also helped. The idea was to let the fabric absorb the sweat, then wash the linen rather than your actual skin. So if you've ever wondered why medieval illustrations show nobles in layers of white linen beneath their finery, the answer is simple. It was the underwear doing the dirty work. And then there were the inevitable pests. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Combs were one line of defense, carefully dragged through the hair in the hopes of removing tiny invaders. Clothing could be boiled to kill off eggs and larvae, though of course, boiling your only tunic meant going without until it dried. Flea traps were another invention, shallow bowls of water set beneath the bed, sometimes with a floating candle, designed to lure fleas to their watery doom. It worked about as well as you think it did, which is to say, not very. Toilets? Let's just say they were more about location than sanitation. Castles had garderobes, little stone chambers jutting out over a moat or pit, where waste dropped straight down. The smell was enough to make anyone reconsider the romance of castle life. In towns, chamber pots were the standard, emptied into streets or rivers when convenient. Imagine leaning out your window at dawn, shouting a warning before tipping yesterday's contents onto the cobblestones. Yes, that's where the phrase, "watch out below," came from, or at least, that's what you'd wish someone shouted before you walked past. And yet, medieval bathhouses were more than just places for scrubbing. They were social hubs, meeting grounds, and sometimes, less than holy establishments. Mixed bathing wasn't unheard of, and moralists fretted over what might happen when naked bodies mingled too freely. Eventually, outbreaks of plague sealed their fate. Public bathhouses were shuttered in many towns, accused of being breeding grounds for both disease and sin. What had once been a lively institution faded into memory. Soap, when available, was homemade, animal fat mixed with lye, boiled until it formed a pungent, often caustic bar. Laundry wasn't much easier. Clothes were scrubbed in rivers, beaten against stones, or steeped in a lye solution. In some places, stale urine was collected and used as a bleaching agent, because ammonia, while unpleasant, gets the job done. Picture your neighbor showing up at your door asking for your donations for laundry day. Community spirit, indeed. And so we come to the quiet question that hovers over all of this: did it work? In their own way, yes. The methods seem crude to us, but in the context of limited resources, superstition, and evolving medical theories, they made sense. People did what they could, balancing between fear of disease, fear of sin, and the undeniable human desire not to stink up the dinner table. When you think about it, medieval hygiene wasn't just about dirt and baths, it was about identity, morality, and survival. To wash or not to wash wasn't simply a question of convenience, it was a reflection of your class, your faith, your fears, and your luck. And maybe that's why the subject still fascinates us. Because when you strip away the castles, the crowns, the battles, and the banners, you're left with people trying to get through the day, and trying, in their own patchwork way, to stay clean. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you probably didn't smell great. But neither did anyone else, so in a way, the playing field was level. What mattered wasn't necessarily the absence of odor, but how you managed it, or disguised it. And that's where medieval creativity truly shined. Perfume, for example, wasn't just a luxury. It was strategy. A small vial of rosewater or lavender essence could be dabbed on the wrists or sprinkled into clothes. Herbs might be sewn directly into little sachets and carried around in pockets. Some people even stitched sprigs of rosemary into their collars, so every time they moved their head, they got a whiff of something other than the person sweating next to them. Imagine wearing your own personal air freshener, pinned right beneath your chin. Practical, if slightly ridiculous. Pomanders became especially popular. These were little balls, often made of metal, filled with cloves, nutmeg, or cinnamon. They dangled from belts or hung around the neck. They jingled when you walked, so everyone knew you were both fashionable and, perhaps, slightly paranoid about smelling like goat. In crowded streets, pomanders were pressed close to noses, not just for comfort, but as a defense against disease. After all, medieval medicine believed that foul smells carried illness. To surround yourself with cinnamon was, in a sense, to build a barrier of spice between you and the Black Death. Whether it worked was debatable, but at least you'd go down smelling festive. Clothing played a crucial role, too. As strange as it seems, people often relied on their linen undergarments more than soap and water. Linen absorbed sweat, oil, and dirt, and could be laundered far more easily than bathing the body itself. Nobles might change their linens daily, enjoying the sensation of cleanliness without touching a drop of water. Peasants, of course, weren't so lucky. Washing and drying linen required time, resources, and more than one pair of garments, which many simply didn't have. For them, one shirt had to do the work of both clothing and cleaning. Medical theory wrapped itself around all of this like a particularly stubborn vine. Physicians spoke in terms of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much or too little of any one humor threw the body into imbalance, causing illness. Bathing, they warned, might disrupt this balance. Hot water opened the pores, they said, letting in bad air, miasma, that could poison you from the inside out. Cold water, meanwhile, could shock the system into imbalance. So while a brisk scrub might sound refreshing to us, to a medieval doctor it was an invitation for catastrophe. This tension between cleanliness and danger created strange compromises. Instead of bathing, people rubbed their bodies with cloths soaked in vinegar, wine, or even spirits, believing the liquid killed harmful vapors. Wealthier households had basins set aside for hand-washing before meals, sometimes scented with herbs for added protection. You didn't need to be spotless, you just needed to be less contaminated than your neighbor. Water itself was a complicated matter. Wells existed, of course, but rivers were the lifeblood of most towns. And rivers were also, inconveniently, dumping grounds. Picture laundry day, chamber pots emptied from windows, and slaughterhouse runoff, all feeding the same stream where children splashed and women filled their buckets. The result was a liquid gamble, thirst versus infection. Boiling helped, but not everyone took the time. Beer and ale became safer staples, not because people liked to be tipsy all day, though many didn't mind, but because brewing killed pathogens. In other words, it wasn't that medieval people ignored hygiene, they simply had different calculations of risk. Drink the water and roll the dice, or drink ale and guarantee a buzz. For nobles, water could be filtered through cloth or mixed with herbs before drinking. Perfumed hand towels were passed around at banquets so guests could wipe away grease. Cleanliness here wasn't just about health, but about performance. To appear in freshly laundered linen, dabbed with scent, hands washed in rosewater, this was social signaling. You weren't simply clean. You were cultured. But perhaps the strangest thing about medieval hygiene was how deeply it was tied to morality. Dirt was often equated with humility, even holiness. Hermits and monks sometimes wore the same rough tunic for months, refusing to wash as a sign of devotion. Smelling bad wasn't failure, it was sacrifice. Saints were said to radiate odor of sanctity, a sweet fragrance that overcame the natural stench of human bodies. In other words, if you reeked but people claimed it smelled like roses, you might be on the fast track to canonization. For the average villager, however, the odor was less divine and more unavoidable. Crowded huts, smoky fires, unwashed clothing, and animals sharing living space made for an atmosphere somewhere between barn and furnace. To cope, people relied on smoke itself, burning herbs like juniper, sage, or frankincense to mask smells and ward off disease. Picture stepping into a peasant cottage, where the air is thick with smoke, eyes watering, walls blackened with soot. It's a homemade disinfectant, a medieval Febreze that doubled as insect repellent. Communal practices reinforced this idea of hygiene as survival. Washing hands before and after meals was encouraged, not just for etiquette but to prevent spreading illness. Seasonal, spring cleans, involved scrubbing floors with sand or herbs, airing out bedding, and boiling garments. These weren't just chores. They were rituals, marking time and anchoring life in a world that could easily feel dirty and chaotic. And yet, medieval people were not oblivious to their reputation. Satirists of the time wrote jokes about bad breath and dirty hair. Chronicles described foul-smelling streets with a mix of humor and horror. Even then, people understood the comedy of odor. The difference is, they didn't always have the luxury of doing much about it. Think of it this way, today, if you forget deodorant, you can swing by a drugstore. In the Middle Ages, if you forgot your sprig of rosemary or your pomander, you had two options: endure your neighbor's smell, or hope they endured yours. Hygiene wasn't just about personal comfort. It was about patience, tolerance, and sometimes, a collective agreement to pretend everything was fine. So when we imagine the Middle Ages, it's tempting to wrinkle our noses. But the truth is, they were constantly improvising. Herbs in collars, vinegar scrubs, linen shirts as sweat sponges, smoky fires to cleanse the air, all of it was resourceful, if imperfect. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson here. Cleanliness wasn't a simple matter of soap and water. It was a performance, a negotiation, and a leap of faith. Because at the end of the day, you couldn't smell like roses, unless you were a saint. And most people were not saints. They were just trying to get through dinner without gagging on the neighbor's garlic breath. When you think of laundry in the Middle Ages, don't picture a gentle spin cycle and lavender-scented dryer sheets. Picture instead a group of women bent over a riverbank, sleeves rolled up, beating heavy cloth against smooth stones until their arms ached. Water sloshes, mud sticks, and the sound is less like a calm wash day and more like an orchestra of slaps and splashes. Soap, if available, was harsh and home-brewed, animal fat mixed with lye, a caustic concoction that could strip grease from fabric, and occasionally strip the skin from your hands. And then there was urine. Yes, you heard that right. Stale urine, rich in ammonia, was collected in buckets and poured over wool to bleach it or over linen to brighten it. In some towns, public piss pots were placed on streets specifically for this purpose. Imagine contributing to your neighborhood laundry by, well, answering nature's call. It was recycling, medieval style, and it worked. But one suspect's laundry day was less than fragrant. For clothing that couldn't survive a dunk in lye or ammonia, there were alternatives. Dusting powders made from chalk or crushed herbs were rubbed into fabric, then brushed out to absorb oils. It was the medieval version of dry cleaning, except instead of handing your gown to a specialist, you'd hand it to a servant armed with chalk dust and a stiff brush. Nobles could afford this kind of care, but peasants usually made do with the river. One shirt, scrubbed once a season, was expected to last years. The concept of a fresh fit wasn't really in their vocabulary. Personal grooming, meanwhile, was a blend of practicality and superstition. Barbers didn't just cut hair, they pulled teeth, set broken bones, and performed minor surgeries. Their shops advertised with the familiar red and white striped pole, symbolizing the blood and bandages of their trade. So when you sat in a barber's chair, you might leave with a trim, or with fewer teeth than you started with. It was one-stop shopping for all your follicular and medical needs. Shaving wasn't universal, but it had its place. Monks often shaved the crown of their heads, the tonsure, as a sign of humility. Knights and nobles might keep beards trimmed, though fashions shifted with the centuries. A clean shave was achieved with sharp razors, sometimes heated in hot water to soften the bristles. Without aftershave, cuts and nicks were common, and infections followed close behind. Think less, luxury shave, and more, rolling dice with tetanus. Women's grooming was another matter entirely. Hair was considered a symbol of beauty, but also of temptation. Married women often covered their hair with veils, hoods, or elaborate headdresses. Underneath, they washed with water when possible, or dusted with powders to keep oil at bay. Lice combs were a constant companion. Imagine the daily ritual: sitting by the hearth, a wooden comb dragged slowly through the hair, while someone examined the teeth of the comb for telltale specks. Not exactly glamorous, but necessary. Cosmetics were surprisingly popular, though frowned upon by the church. Pale skin was the ideal, a sign that you weren't out toiling in fields. To achieve it, women sometimes applied lead-based powders, or mixtures of vinegar and egg whites that tightened the skin into a ghostly sheen. Rouge for cheeks and lips was made from crushed berries or tinted clays. The effect could be striking, or hazardous. Lead, after all, doesn't make for a long and healthy life. But beauty has always had its price, and in the Middle Ages, that price might be your liver. Class differences were stark. A noble woman might have a chest of perfumes, powders, and combs, while a peasant woman had only a single rag and perhaps a sprig of herbs. Nobles bathed occasionally in scented tubs, their servants heating and carrying water bucket by bucket. Peasants splashed in streams, if they were lucky, or simply wiped down with a damp cloth. The smell of a noble court was masked with incense, sweet herbs scattered on rush-strewn floors. The smell of a peasant's hut was masked with more smoke. A fire constantly smoldering on the hearth, filling the space with a haze that dulled the odors of sweat, livestock, and damp straw. Even in cities, class decided your scent. Wealthy merchants might afford perfumed gloves, literally soaking fine leather in scented oils so that shaking hands became a fragrant experience. Butchers, tanners, and laborers smelled perpetually of their trade. There was no hiding it. You were what you did, and everyone's nose knew it. The rituals of cleanliness also served as social markers. To wash your hands before a meal wasn't just polite, it was a way of signaling refinement. Special basins were brought to the table, with scented water poured over fingers. Towels were passed around. To skip this was to invite whispers. Perhaps you were uncouth, or worse, untrustworthy. Clean hands meant clean intentions. But for peasants, eating meant grabbing bread, meat, or porridge with whatever hand wasn't currently swatting flies. Washing was practical only if water was nearby and the day's work allowed for it. Etiquette, after all, takes time, and time was a luxury when survival was at stake. What's fascinating is how grooming tied directly into medieval ideas of health. Physicians prescribed combing the hair to stimulate the scalp and release vapors. Bathing in certain herbs was believed to balance humors. Vinegar rubs were said to strengthen the body against plague. Hygiene wasn't just about appearances. It was medicine, faith, and habit all braided together like the plaits in a noblewoman's hair. And through it all, one theme repeats: imperfection. Nobody came away truly clean. Clothes still carried stains. Bodies still carried smells. Hair still carried lice. The effort was constant, but the victory was temporary. Hygiene was a battle fought daily, and often lost by nightfall. Yet people kept trying. Because no matter the century, no matter the technology, humans have always sought that fleeting feeling of freshness, the sense that, however briefly, we are presentable. So if you picture a medieval villager scrubbing a tunic with urine-soaked water, or a noblewoman dusting her face with poisonous powder, don't laugh too hard. Swap the lye soap for a bottle of shampoo, the chalk dust for a dry cleaner's tag, the pomander for a spray of perfume, and you might realize we haven't changed that much. The tools differ. The desire is the same. To smell acceptable. To look respectable. To belong. If you were dropped into the middle of a medieval town, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the architecture, the market stalls, or even the clanging of blacksmiths. It would be the smell. Cities in the Middle Ages were vibrant hubs of trade and culture, yes, but they were also experiments in waste management that frequently failed. Picture the streets, narrow, crooked lanes paved with cobblestones, if you were lucky. More often, they were just mud, trampled by hooves, wheels, and countless feet. Into these same lanes went almost everything unwanted. Chamber pots were emptied from upstairs windows, sometimes with a polite warning shouted below, but not always. Waste from butchers, tanners, and fishmongers ran down gutters. Rain mixed with dung, ash, and food scraps, turning the street into something between a soup and a trap. Travelers often wrote about these conditions, not with disgusted surprise, but with weary acknowledgement. It was simply how life was. And then there were the animals. Cities weren't just filled with people. Cows, pigs, chickens, and goats all shared the space. They provided food and income, but also left their contributions underfoot. If you've ever stepped in something unpleasant while walking your dog, imagine multiplying that by several thousand and sprinkling it liberally across your morning commute. Authorities did try, from time to time, to impose order. Some towns appointed gong farmers, whose unfortunate job was to shovel waste from cesspits and privies. Imagine descending into a pit of filth with only a wooden spade and sheer willpower, hauling bucket after bucket of human waste to be dumped beyond city walls. It was grueling, dangerous, and, unsurprisingly, well paid. But without them, cesspits overflowed, leaking into basements or seeping into wells. Public health in the Middle Ages often depended on the willingness of a few unlucky souls to do the dirtiest job imaginable. Water supply was another constant challenge. Wells dotted towns, but contamination was common. Rivers provided fresh water upstream, but downstream they became receptacles for everything from laundry soap to tanning chemicals. In London, the Thames served as both drinking fountain and sewer. Everyone knew this was less than ideal, but alternatives were scarce. To cope, people boiled water, flavored it with herbs, or simply skipped it in favor of ale. Even children drank small beer, weak, low-alcohol brews safer than raw water. You might not grow up tall and strong, but at least you wouldn't die from dysentery at age 7. Public baths had once offered some relief, but as fears of disease grew, these fell into decline. When the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, bathhouses were accused of spreading plague. Authorities shuttered them, and suspicion toward communal bathing grew. From then on, cleanliness shifted inward: linen underclothes, dry rubs, herbal smoke. Townsfolk still craved cleanliness, but public infrastructure retreated. What had once been a social ritual became a private struggle. Disease haunted every crowded street. Leprosy, dysentery, typhoid, these flourished where sanitation faltered. To cope, cities created leper hospitals on the outskirts, where the afflicted were isolated. The logic was as much about moral judgment as medical precaution. Leprosy was seen as both punishment and contagion, a visible mark of sin. To expel sufferers was to purify the community, or so the authorities told themselves. For the lepers, it meant exile and slow decline. Hygiene here wasn't just about dirt. It was about stigma. And then came the plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing perhaps half the population, cleanliness took on apocalyptic weight. Theories abounded. Some believed foul smells carried disease, so towns lit bonfires of herbs to purify the air. Others blamed stagnant water, so wells were covered and fountains cleansed. Still others turned to prayer, flagellation, or scapegoats. Hygiene became entangled with desperation. If washing with vinegar might save you, you washed. If avoiding bathhouses might protect you, you abstained. Fear rewrote the rules. But even outside of plague years, towns made small attempts at public health. Markets were regulated, at least on paper. Laws forbade butchers from throwing entrails into rivers, though compliance was spotty. Tanneries and dyers, infamous for their chemical stench, were sometimes pushed to city outskirts. Water conduits and fountains were built in larger towns, channeling fresh supplies from springs or hills. These efforts weren't consistent, but they showed an awareness. People knew filth brought danger. They just didn't always have the tools to fix it. For ordinary people, coping strategies were humble. Herbs were scattered on floors, both for fragrance and to deter pests. Rushes were spread underfoot, then periodically swept away with whatever filth had accumulated. Shoes were thick and sturdy, designed to protect against more than just rocks. Clothing layers kept grime at bay, absorbing sweat and shielding skin from the environment. In the absence of modern sanitation, survival often came down to clever layering, of fabric, of fragrance, of tolerance. If you imagine a medieval city as dirty beyond redemption, though, remember this, it was also home. People laughed, traded, prayed, and loved in those same alleys. They swept their thresholds, aired their linens, and took pride in what little order they could impose. A clean shirt on Sunday, a fragrant herb pinned to a tunic, a basin of water passed around before supper, these were small acts of dignity in a world where dirt was everywhere. What's striking is how public health and private hygiene blurred together. A city wasn't clean unless its people were, and its people couldn't be clean unless the city supported them. Failures of infrastructure became failures of individuals, and vice versa. And out of this tangled mess came a truth we still live with today. Cleanliness is not just personal. It's communal. So when we picture medieval towns, it's easy to wrinkle our noses. The muck, the stench, the chaos, it seems unbearable. But look closer, and you see a society constantly improvising. Gong farmers in the pits, women at the riverside, children with herbs tucked in collars, physicians writing advice both laughable and sincere. It was messy, yes. But it was also human. Because in the end, medieval hygiene was never just about washing dirt away. It was about holding chaos at bay. One chamber pot, one bucket, one handful of herbs at a time. If medieval towns were an assault on the senses, the countryside offered a slightly different perfume, less concentrated, but no less pungent. Out here, the smells came not from overflowing cesspits and tanners' vats, but from the daily intimacy of people, animals, and earth, all sharing the same cramped spaces. The average peasant household was not the tidy thatched cottage of storybooks. It was one room, maybe two if fortune smiled. The floor was packed earth. The roof was thatch, alive with insects and sometimes the odd bird or mouse nesting overhead. Livestock often shared the space, chickens scratching underfoot, a goat tied near the hearth, even a pig rooting in a corner. Why keep animals inside? Because they provided warmth in winter, and because locking them out meant risking theft. A medieval cow was far too valuable to leave to the mercy of passing strangers. This meant hygiene in rural life began with acceptance. You lived in mud, among beasts, and with whatever surprises the wind carried through the cracks in your walls. Sweeping helped, yes, but sweeping often meant pushing dust, straw, and droppings to one side, not creating a pristine surface. Fresh rushes or straw might be spread to soften the floor and absorb mess. Once they became too foul, they were carted outside and replaced. Water came from wells, streams, or ponds. And here lay another challenge. The same pond where you drew water might be where the animals drank, bathed, and occasionally drowned. Wells could collapse, become stagnant, or be fouled by runoff. A careful household might cover theirs, but plenty did not. The advice of medieval physicians to drink from clear, flowing springs was admirable, but it presupposed that such springs were nearby, and not already claimed by someone wealthier. Bathing was less frequent than in towns with bathhouses, but peasants were not wholly resigned to filth. Rivers and ponds offered opportunities in warmer months. Children splashed, adults waded, and laundry was beaten on stones. Was it hygienic by modern standards? Hardly, but it provided at least some relief from grime. In winter, water was too precious and too cold to waste. Instead, linen undergarments were again the hero, changed, rinsed, and dried when possible, they offered the illusion of cleanliness beneath layers of mud-streaked wool. Laundry days were community events. Women gathered at streams, kneeling on banks, scrubbing fabric against stones, and chatting while their knuckles reddened in icy water. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes mixed with water to create a primitive lye, adding a touch of bleaching power. Clothes were beaten, wrung, and spread on bushes or grass to dry. The smell of fresh laundry was fleeting, soon replaced by the sense of smoke, sweat, and soil, but for a moment, there was the satisfaction of visible cleanliness, of fabric lighter and whiter than the day before. Hygiene here was inseparable from the seasons. Spring meant mud, with animals emerging from barns and fields turning to sludge. Summer brought sweat, insects, and the constant risk of spoiled food. Autumn was harvest time, when dirt seemed a badge of labor. And winter was the great indoor season, doors shut tight, fires smoking, people and animals clustered together. Imagine weeks without fresh air, the floor damp with melting snow tramped in by boots, the roof dripping, the rushes blackened. You didn't fight it, you endured it. Personal grooming was basic but not neglected. Wooden combs, sometimes finely carved, were common even among peasants. They were not just for vanity, they were weapons against lice and fleas. Picking at each other's hair was both social and practical, a ritual of bonding with a hygienic purpose. Beards might be trimmed with shears, fingernails scraped with knives. Feet, perpetually dirty, were sometimes washed before bed, if only for comfort. These were the small mercies in a life where mud seemed permanent. Animals added both comfort and chaos. Cats helped with mice, but they also left their own messes. Dogs guarded the yard, but they too brought fleas inside. Pigs, though messy, could eat scraps and provide warmth. To live in a medieval peasant hut was to live in constant negotiation with your animals. They were companions, investments, and hygiene hazards all at once. To outsiders, especially the elite, peasant life was synonymous with filth. Chroniclers described muddy, smoky hovels, where families and beasts lay together. But this perspective misses something important. Peasants were not indifferent to dirt. They cared, deeply, about cleanliness. They simply had fewer tools. Washing feet, combing hair, laundering linen, scattering herbs, these were acts of dignity, assertions of order in a world stacked against them. There was also ritual cleanliness. Before meals, hands were washed, often in a shared basin passed around the table. Guests might be offered water for rinsing upon arrival. These gestures mattered, not because they eliminated germs, a concept centuries away, but because they upheld standards of courtesy and care. To present yourself with washed hands and a combed head was to declare that you respected both yourself and your company. The countryside, too, had its own perfumes. The smell of dung and smoke was constant, yes, but so were the scents of wild herbs, cut hay, and baking bread. Floors strewn with mint or lavender masked the worst odors. Garlands of dried flowers or pungent herbs were hung in rafters. Smoke from the hearth, though choking at times, also preserved meat and drove away insects. These were natural sanitizers, imperfect but comforting. Rural hygiene, then, was not a story of neglect. It was a story of compromise. A life lived close to animals, close to soil, and close to the raw materials of existence. Peasants were not filthier because they didn't care. They were filthier because survival demanded it. Their huts were not pristine cottages but living organisms, where humans and beasts, insects and smoke, mud and straw all shared space. And yet, within that, there was care. A clean shirt on feast days, washed feet at night, combs passed through tangled hair, a basin offered to a guest. These were not luxuries, they were declarations that even in the humblest hut, people sought dignity. Hygiene was not about erasing dirt, but about rising above it, even if only briefly. So when you imagine a peasant household, don't picture a caricature of filth. Picture resilience. Picture a family sweeping out rushes, hanging linen on bushes to dry, rubbing their feet before sleep. Picture a child splashing in a stream, laughing despite the chill. Hygiene in the countryside was not perfect, but it was constant, and it mattered. Because even surrounded by mud, people still wanted to feel human. If you ever asked a medieval physician how to stay clean and healthy, the answer would not be, wash your hands twice a day and floss. Instead, you'd get a lecture on balance, humors, and the delicate art of not angering your spleen. Hygiene, to them, was not just soap and water. It was a philosophy, a fragile negotiation between body, soul, and the four famous fluids sloshing around inside you: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The idea was simple enough in theory: too much of one humor, and you were doomed. Excess blood? You'd be feverish. Too much phlegm? Prepare to cough and groan. Black bile made you melancholic, yellow bile made you furious. The cure, naturally, was to restore balance, through food, drink, exercise, bathing, and sometimes a healthy dose of leeches. Yes, leeches. Because what better way to regain balance than to let a creature suck on you until you faint? Physicians prescribed bloodletting for almost everything, from headaches to indigestion. Hygiene played into this because a clean body was one where humors flowed freely, not obstructed by filth, bad diet, or sinful living. Bathing was often recommended in moderation. Warm baths could soothe aches and purge impurities. But beware, too much hot water might open the pores and let in disease. Medieval doctors were very suspicious of pores. They imagined them as little gateways through which illness drifted like a thief in the night. Hence the fear that public bathhouses, with their steamy rooms and crowded tubs, were less cleansing rituals than invitations to disaster. Instead, physicians recommended bathing occasionally, at certain times of year, and only under the right astrological conditions. Yes, even the stars had opinions about your hygiene. A bath taken when Mars was in the wrong house might do more harm than good. You could almost imagine a medieval horoscope: avoid hot water this week. Mercury is in retrograde, and your pores are vulnerable. Cleansing could also be internal. Laxatives, emetics, and purges were prescribed to rid the body of corrupted humors. Some were herbal: senna leaves, aloe, rhubarb. Others were harsher, involving mercury or antimony. The result was, of course, dramatic. To vomit or purge was to become clean, at least by their logic. You weren't just ridding yourself of last night's questionable stew, you were expelling imbalance, resetting your body's internal hygiene. Perfumes and fumigations were also part of the medical toolkit. Bad air, or miasma, was thought to cause disease. If a plague swept through town, the advice wasn't to quarantine, it was to light a fire of sweet herbs, carry a pomander of cloves, or inhale rose water. To smell something pleasant was to protect yourself. This explains why doctors during the Black Death famously wore those beak-shaped masks stuffed with spices, not a fashion statement, but a medieval version of an air purifier. For the skin, ointments made of animal fat, herbs, and sometimes ground gemstones were recommended. Did you have a rash? Rub it with a salve of goose grease and sage. Toothache? Apply a paste of honey and ashes. Baldness? Smear your scalp with onion juice and maybe an egg yolk for shine. Some remedies sound quaint, others borderline cruel. But behind them was the conviction that hygiene was inseparable from health. Hair washing also had its rules. Physicians warned against wetting the head too often, lest moisture seep in and disturb the brain. Yet they also recommended cleansing with vinegar, rosemary water, or even urine, believed to have antiseptic properties. Yes, urine again. For medieval medicine, almost every bodily fluid was a potential treatment, because nothing went to waste, and everything was connected. Dental hygiene fell under the same philosophy. The idea wasn't to prevent cavities. Sugar was scarce enough that tooth decay was less common among peasants, but to keep the breath sweet and the gums strong. Mouth rinses of wine, vinegar, or herbs were common. Chewing sticks from aromatic woods doubled as toothbrushes. Powdered mixtures of salt, sage, and sometimes even crushed bone were rubbed onto teeth with rags. It was rough, but it worked. The church, too, weighed in on cleanliness, though less in terms of humors and more in terms of sin. Excessive bathing was frowned upon, not because it spread germs, but because it suggested vanity or indulgence. A clean soul mattered more than a clean body. Yet monasteries often kept bathhouses and encouraged washing before prayer. Monks, in their peculiar way, were some of the cleanest people in medieval Europe, not out of health paranoia, but because ritual demanded it. Physicians tried to bridge these worlds, the spiritual and the physical. A healthy body was in harmony with both God and nature. To wash, purge, perfume, and groom was to align yourself with cosmic order. To neglect hygiene was to invite imbalance, sickness, and perhaps divine displeasure. And while much of their advice seems quaint, or outright dangerous, it had logic within its own framework. When disease struck, and nobody understood microbes, the theory of humors offered a system. It gave people explanations, rituals, and remedies. Hygiene became less about eliminating dirt and more about maintaining balance. So imagine yourself, sick in bed, calling a physician. He arrives in his scholar's robe, a book of Galen under one arm. He feels your pulse, frowns, and declares your humors disturbed. He prescribes a mild bath, followed by a purge, a fumigation of rosemary, and a stricter diet. He tells you to comb your hair to stimulate circulation, wash your hands before meals, and sleep on your right side to aid digestion. You obey, not because it always works, but because it feels like order in a chaotic world. Medieval medicine was hygiene wrapped in philosophy. It asked not, "Are you clean?" but, "Are you balanced?" The tools were crude, the theories flawed, but the intent was familiar: to find health, comfort, and a measure of control in the face of uncertainty. And in that sense, medieval medicine was not so far from us. After all, don't we still chase miracle diets, cleansing regimens, detox teas, and trendy bombs, convinced that health comes from purging toxins or balancing unseen forces? Perhaps humors never really left us. They just changed names. When we talk about hygiene, it's easy to imagine a purely practical world of baths, combs, and laundry. But human beings are never satisfied with the merely practical. Even in an age of mud, smoke, and fleas, people long to look beautiful, to appear refined, radiant, or at least less weathered by toil and disease. And so, medieval hygiene often bled into the shimmering, sometimes questionable realm of cosmetics. If you were wealthy, you had options. Pale skin was the ideal of beauty, signaling that you did not labor under the sun. Achieving this required effort, because medieval Europe was not exactly airbrushed Instagram. Ladies and courtiers smeared their faces with mixtures of white lead, vinegar, and egg whites. The result? A ghostly, porcelain pallor, the medieval version of a beauty filter. Of course, the lead was toxic, but that was a problem for future generations. For now, it meant looking fashionably sickly, which was somehow a compliment. Men, too, cared for appearances. Shaving was a luxury, often performed by barbers who doubled as minor surgeons. Beards came and went in fashion, but neat grooming signaled status. A fine-combed beard or smooth jawline meant you had the time and resources to care for yourself. In a society where most peasants were permanently grubby, appearance spoke loudly. Perfume was the great equalizer. If you could afford it, you doused yourself in rose water, lavender oil, or musk. Scent was more than indulgence, it was defense. Physicians warned that foul odors carried disease, so sweet smells were believed to protect. Carrying a pomander, a small ball of spices, herbs, or resin, was both fashionable and hygienic. It dangled from belts, swung from chains, or was clasped in the hand like a medieval stress ball. The richer you smelled, the safer you were supposed to be. Hair care, too, was about beauty as much as hygiene. Blonde hair was especially prized in Northern Europe, sometimes enhanced with rinses of saffron, onion skins, or chamomile. Women bleached their locks in the sun, sitting outside with their hair combed over wooden frames, letting herbs and lemon-like juices do their work. Men trimmed their hair in styles dictated by courts and kings, while peasants wore it longer, more practical, less fashionable. Head coverings, veils, wimples, hoods, or hats, were common, not just for warmth or modesty, but because lice were a fact of life. A covered head hid much. Cosmetics also touched the eyes. Kohl, imported through trade routes from the Middle East, was sometimes used to darken lashes and brows. Herbal concoctions gave eyes a brighter look, though some contained poisonous ingredients like belladonna, which dilated pupils. Imagine risking blindness just to look more alluring by candlelight. Beauty, then as now, demanded sacrifice. But for every noble with a box of powders, peasants had their own rustic rituals. They washed their faces with cool water in the mornings, combed their hair, and sometimes rubbed their skin with herbs or even fresh butter to soften it. It sounds odd, but in a world of biting wind and rough work, butter could be a crude moisturizer. Rural brides might redden their cheeks with berries before a festival. For all the dirt and toil, people still sought moments of radiance. The church, predictably, looked askance at many of these practices. To beautify oneself was often condemned as vanity, a sin of pride. Too much care for one's appearance was seen as dangerous to the soul. Yet even monasteries made allowances for basic grooming. Monks were tonsured, their hair shaved in distinctive circles. Nuns washed their faces and hands. Hygiene might be spiritualized, but it was still present. There was also the subtle politics of beauty. A clean, well-presented noblewoman wasn't just pleasing to the eye, she was a walking statement about her family's wealth and honor. Her gleaming skin, perfumed robes, and carefully styled hair told visitors that her household could afford imported oils, fine linens, and servants to prepare them. Beauty was hygiene made visible, a kind of living advertisement. Wigs and false hairpieces also appeared in wealthier circles, often braided with ribbons, beads, or even gold thread. For some, this was necessity. Lice infestations or illness might rob you of your natural locks. For others, it was pure fashion. The wig gave you the look of vitality, even when your scalp betrayed you. And let's not forget teeth. By later medieval times, sugar had entered Europe in small but growing amounts, especially among the rich. This meant tooth decay became a mark of wealth, bizarrely enough. Some nobles even blackened their teeth deliberately, to show that they could afford sugar. Dental hygiene lagged behind, but tooth powders of sage, mint, and salt circulated. Mouthwashes of wine or vinegar freshened breath. In a world where smells defined social interaction, sweet breath mattered as much as clear skin. Cosmetics, then, were not frivolous extras. They were hygiene's theatrical cousin. They announced who you were, who you wanted to be, and how seriously you took your place in the world. To smear on a paste, to scent your hair, to polish your nails, these were not just acts of self-care. They were declarations of status, desire, and belonging. But the risks were real. Lead makeup poisoned the skin. Belladonna drops risked blindness. Harsh dyes burned scalps. The line between beauty and harm was thin, and many crossed it unknowingly. Yet still they painted, perfumed, and powdered. Because the alternative was worse, to be seen as uncared for, shabby, or unworthy of notice. Imagine yourself at a medieval feast. Candles flicker, music plays. Across the hall sits a noblewoman with alabaster skin, golden hair gleaming, perfume of roses drifting across the table. You know her toilette that morning involved lead paste, vinegar rinses, and herbs from distant lands. None of that is visible now. What you see is radiance. What you smell is sweetness. And in that moment, hygiene has transcended filth, transformed into art. It is easy to laugh at medieval beauty routines, to roll our eyes at lead makeup or butter as lotion. But really, are we so different? We bleach, we dye, we smear chemicals on our faces in the hope of eternal youth. We chase trends, endure risks, and call it self-expression. Perhaps the only thing that has changed is packaging. The desire to appear beautiful, clean, fresh, alluring, is as old as humanity. And so, medieval hygiene cannot be understood apart from cosmetics. To clean was to beautify, and to beautify was to declare yourself civilized. Dirt was the enemy, yes, but so too was plainness. A little rouge, a little perfume, a carefully combed lock of hair, these were the medieval signatures of dignity. Even in an age of mud and smoke, people still wanted to shine. If private hygiene was a battle against dirt in cottages, castles, and bathhouses, public hygiene was a full-blown war, fought in markets, feasts, and streets, where humanity gathered in all its unwashed splendor. Because in the Middle Ages, to live was to share. You shared food, you shared disease, you shared the air thick with smoke, and yes, you shared smells, whether you wanted to or not. Let's begin with the medieval feast, that theatrical explosion of food, drink, and questionable hygiene. Imagine a great hall, tables lined with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread acting as plates. Knives were common, forks not yet popular, so most people ate with their fingers. Did they wash before eating? Yes, in theory. A basin of water was often passed around before the meal. Guests dipped their hands, maybe even wiped them on a towel. But once the feast began, hands roamed across meat, sauces, and bread. Grease shone on chins and dripped from fingers. Bones were tossed to the floor, scraps thrown to the dogs. A noble feast was not the delicate, candlelit elegance we imagine. It was a sensory carnival, equal parts glamour and grime. Markets, too, were theaters of smell. Picture a bustling town square, fishmongers shouting their wares, butchers hacking at carcasses, bakers selling loaves hot from smoky ovens. The aroma of bread mingled with the stench of raw meat and the sharp tang of tanneries nearby. Water ran through open gutters, carrying waste along cobbled streets. Yet this was the heart of medieval life. Not sterile, not polished, but alive. Hygiene here was not about spotless stalls, it was about survival. You washed your vegetables if you could. You trusted your nose to tell you if fish was fresh. You chewed herbs to mask the taste of rancid butter. Pilgrimages added another layer of public hygiene, or perhaps public lack thereof. Thousands of people trudged across Europe to shrines, hostels, and holy sites. Imagine the dust, the sweat, the crowded inns. Bedding was shared, floors were packed with bodies, and fleas traveled merrily from pilgrim to pilgrim. Washing was limited, often just a splash at a roadside stream. Yet pilgrimage was considered purifying for the soul, even if the body emerged dirtier than when it set out. Relics were kissed by lips unwashed for weeks, and holy water fountains served both as sacred refreshment and the occasional rinse. To be a pilgrim was to accept grime as a companion on the road to grace. Hospitals were another window into communal hygiene. Do not imagine gleaming white wards with crisp sheets. Medieval hospitals were more like hostels for the sick and poor, run by monks and nuns. Patients lay in rows, often sharing beds. Clean linen was prized, but resources were scarce. Washing the sick was considered both a spiritual duty and a medical practice, though soap was rudimentary and water often reused. Yet within their means, caregivers tried. They laundered sheets when possible, combed hair, offered fresh shifts of linen. Monastic rules emphasized bathing the infirm, not out of concern for germs, but because cleanliness symbolized charity and divine order. And then there were the streets themselves, the ultimate stage of public hygiene. Towns and cities struggled constantly with waste. Regulations attempted to keep order. Don't throw slops into the street, don't let your pigs wander freely, don't dump carcasses into the river. Naturally, people ignored them. Chamber pots were emptied from windows with a shout of warning, or not. Gutters overflowed. In some towns, gong farmers were hired to clear cesspits, their work so foul it was done only at night. Even then, the smell lingered. Yet life continued. Children played, vendors sold wares, lovers strolled, all amid the backdrop of waste and water. Public hygiene also meant rituals of collective washing. Before Mass, hands might be rinsed at church doors. At guild feasts, shared basins were provided. Fountains and public wells were central, not just for drinking but for washing faces, filling buckets, and laundering small items. Women gathered there to scrub clothes, gossiping as they wrung linen. These fountains were the lifeblood of hygiene, and they were jealously guarded. To pollute a town's well was a serious crime, recognized as an attack on the community itself. Festivals offered a different side of cleanliness, or the suspension of it. Carnival season, with its masks, food fights, and chaos, was a time when hygiene rules broke down. People paraded in costumes, smeared themselves with soot, flour, or worse. Cleanliness mattered less than spectacle. Yet afterward, a communal reset took place, streets swept, fountains cleared, and normal rituals of washing resumed. Dirt was both embraced and expelled, part of the cycle of the year. For the wealthy, public hygiene was also a way to display status. Carrying perfumed gloves, embroidered handkerchiefs, or ornate combs signaled refinement. Publicly washing one's hands before a meal, in full view of guests, was a statement, "Look how civilized I am." The poor might wash from necessity, the rich washed from pride. But the line between private and public hygiene was blurry. In a world where water was fetched from wells, where streets doubled as sewers, and where communal baths were social hubs, your cleanliness was never entirely your own. It was shared, negotiated, and constantly tested by the crowd. And yet, amid the smells and filth, people developed a kind of resilience. They tolerated what we could not, and they found dignity where we might see only disgust. A hand rinsed in a fountain, a head combed beneath an open window, a pilgrim washing dust from his face before kneeling at a shrine, these were public moments of hygiene, as symbolic as they were practical. So the next time you imagine a medieval town square, don't see only the mud and muck. Hear the laughter of children, the gossip of women at the well, the music of a festival. Smell the bread, the herbs, the smoke, the manure. Hygiene was there, not perfect, not modern, but woven into the very rhythm of public life. It wasn't about being spotless. It was about being human, together, in a world that was gloriously messy. If the streets, markets, and feasts revealed the messy public side of hygiene, religion brought a different lens altogether. For medieval people, cleanliness was not simply a matter of health or vanity, it was deeply tied to ideas of morality, sin, and salvation. To be clean was to be closer to God. To be dirty could mean more than just physical grime, it could signify spiritual decay. And so hygiene took on a ritual weight, a kind of sacred choreography that shaped daily life. Take, for example, the monasteries. These were not merely centers of prayer, they were laboratories of order, rhythm, and, surprisingly, hygiene. Monastic rules, particularly those inspired by Saint Benedict, emphasized bathing the sick, laundering linens, and maintaining clean spaces. Not because monks understood germs, but because order and purity reflected divine harmony. In many monasteries, lavatoriums, stone basins with running water, were built specifically for communal washing. Before meals, monks lined up to rinse their hands. Before prayers, they washed again. Water was both practical and symbolic, cleansing the flesh while preparing the spirit. Monastic bathhouses also existed, though not all orders viewed bathing with equal enthusiasm. The Cistercians, for example, encouraged simplicity and moderation, which meant washing was allowed but not indulged. Still, baths were built into many cloisters, often with channels of running water, a luxury that peasants outside the walls could scarcely imagine. Even when monks wore the same rough habits for days, the principle of ritual washing persisted. Cleanliness, however modest, was part of serving God. Religious rituals for laypeople also reflected this intertwining of hygiene and holiness. Holy water at church entrances wasn't just symbolic, it was also a quick splash of cleansing before entering sacred space. Pilgrims washed before approaching shrines, not only to honor the saints but also to present themselves as spiritually purified. In Islamic Spain, ablutions before prayer were a visible reminder that faith and washing could not be separated. Even in Christian Europe, where ritual bathing was less rigidly codified, the link between water and purity was ever present. Confession and penance, too, often carried language of washing. To confess was to cleanse the soul, to be made spotless before God. The metaphor of dirt as sin ran deep in medieval thought. Filth was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous, both physically and spiritually. This is why leprosy carried such a heavy stigma. It was seen not just as disease but as a mark of inner corruption. And so those who were visibly unclean often faced exclusion, a harsh reminder that hygiene was bound up with morality. Pilgrimage sites sometimes offered baths or fountains where the faithful could wash. At Canterbury, pilgrims visiting the shrine of Thomas Becket might wash in nearby streams. At Santiago de Compostela, fountains were placed along the routes for weary travelers. Washing along the way became a ritual, a preparation, a shedding of worldly grime before standing in the presence of the holy. It was not unlike the symbolic washing before communion, a gesture that said, body and soul must be made ready. The Church also shaped hygiene through festivals and fasts. Lent, for example, often meant reduced bathing, as the denial of comfort was seen as spiritually strengthening. Feasts of purification, on the other hand, sometimes included washing rituals. Candlemas, tied to the purification of the Virgin Mary, emphasized both inner and outer cleansing. The rhythm of the liturgical calendar guided when bodies were scrubbed or allowed to linger in dirt. Priests themselves were bound to stricter standards of cleanliness, at least in theory. Before celebrating Mass, washing was expected. Vestments were meant to be clean, white linen symbolizing purity. In practice, rural priests might not have had the luxury of spotless garments or daily washing, but the ideal remained: the servant of God should be as unblemished as the altar he approached. For ordinary people, religion gave hygiene its weight. To wash before meals was sensible. To wash before prayer was sacred. To bathe was sometimes luxury, sometimes penance. And when plagues or disasters struck, the failure of hygiene was often interpreted not as a problem of water or waste, but as a punishment from God. If rivers ran foul, if wells went dry, if lice infested the body, these were reminders of humanity's fallen state, waiting for divine mercy. Yet it would be wrong to imagine medieval religion as only repressive or fearful. In many ways, it nurtured habits of hygiene. Monks taught peasants how to build latrines, how to channel water, how to wash wounds. Nuns nursed the sick, combed hair, and laundered sheets. Pilgrimage routes provided not only spiritual renewal but also practical spaces for washing and rest. Religion kept hygiene alive, not always perfectly, but persistently, through rituals that were as much about comfort as they were about the soul. There is something oddly comforting in this union of faith and washing. Imagine a monk in a quiet cloister, dipping his hands into cool stone basins before joining his brothers in prayer. Imagine a pilgrim pausing by a roadside spring, rinsing his dusty face before pressing onward toward a holy shrine. Imagine a nun bending over a sickbed, wiping a fevered brow with fresh cloth, whispering a prayer as she worked. Hygiene here was not sterile, not clinical. It was tender, ritualized, and deeply human. So when we think of medieval hygiene and religion, perhaps we should set aside the image of filth and superstition. Instead, picture a rhythm of water and prayer, of hands rinsed before meals, of garments washed for feast days, of fountains and holy wells where body and soul met in a single act. It was not about germ theory. It was about grace. And maybe that is why, despite the dirt and disease, medieval life never lost its dignity. For every cesspit in the street, there was also a basin of holy water at the church door. For every grimy alley, a cloister fountain. For every fear of disease, a ritual of cleansing that whispered, yes, the world is messy, but there is still order, still hope, still purity to be found. We've wandered through baths and basins, combed through lice and fleas, peeked into garderobes, sniffed the perfumes, and held our noses through the worst of it. We've seen hygiene shaped by fear, by faith, by custom, and by sheer necessity. And now, as we reach the end of our journey through the pungent corridors of medieval life, it's time to ask the simplest and strangest of questions. Did it work? The short answer is yes, and no. Medieval hygiene wasn't good by modern standards. Germs ran rampant, plagues swept through towns, and most people would have smelled like damp wool, smoke, and sweat rather than lavender or citrus. But it worked enough. People survived. Children grew into adults. Villages thrived, markets bustled, churches filled, songs were sung. Humanity muddled through, as it always does. Take linen, for example. Medieval people clung to their belief that clean shirts kept them clean, and in a way, they were right. Fresh undergarments wicked away sweat, trapped oils, and were boiled or beaten against stones until they gleamed again. It wasn't soap and hot showers, but it was something. The habit of changing linen daily among the wealthy, weekly among the rest, actually did improve cleanliness, even if they didn't know why. Or look at the herbal remedies and perfumes. Did pomanders filled with rosemary and cloves stop plague? No. Did they mask the worst odors of life in a crowded town? Absolutely. Alum rubbed under the arms wouldn't stop bacteria, but it dulled the smell. Eggs cracked into hair made a sticky mess, but the yolks added shine. Chewing sticks and rough paste scratched at tartar. Crude, improvised, sometimes absurd, but each small gesture chipped away at the grime. And then there's the social side. Bathhouses where neighbors soaked together weren't just about washing, they were about connection. Laundry days by the river weren't just about scrubbing, they were about gossip, laughter, shared burdens. Hygiene wasn't only a private ritual, it was a communal act, woven into the rhythm of life. The sound of water trickling through monastery pipes, the splash of buckets dumped from windows, the slap of linen against stones, these were as much part of the medieval soundscape as bells or chants. Of course, there were failures, spectacular ones. The fear of bathing spreading plague meant many abandoned regular washing just when it was most needed. Garderobes hanging over castle moats eventually poisoned the water they relied on. Refuse piled high in alleys became breeding grounds for rats and fleas. When religion tied cleanliness too tightly to morality, the sick were shunned instead of healed. And when nobles masked their smells with perfume instead of soap, they convinced themselves they were fragrant, when really, they carried an entire ecosystem beneath their silks. But in the balance, medieval hygiene was not pure chaos. It was an ongoing experiment. Trial and error across centuries. People did what they could with what they had. Boiling combs for lice. Scraping pots for soap. Splashing holy water on foreheads. Dousing floors with herbs to chase away smells. Even urine, collected and left to rot, found its purpose in bleaching cloth. Nothing was wasted. Every trick mattered. And through it all, there's something oddly endearing. You, sitting in your clean, climate-controlled room, probably take for granted your shower, your toothpaste, your deodorant stick. But if you close your eyes and imagine yourself as a medieval peasant, rising in the dark, pulling on linen, rinsing your face in a wooden basin, combing straw and fleas out of your hair, you see how normal it was. Not pleasant, not fragrant, but normal. They weren't wallowing in filth. They were surviving, improvising, maintaining dignity in a world that offered little comfort. What's striking is how much of it remains with us. The linen shirt has become the cotton undershirt. The scented pomander has become the aerosol spray. The public bathhouse has become the spa. The monastery lavatorium has become the public sink. Even the urge to complain about how bad the streets smell in summer, yes, we've kept that too. Our world feels cleaner because our science is sharper, but our instincts haven't changed. We still crave freshness. We still fear odor. We still dress cleanliness in the language of morality. And maybe that's the lesson. Hygiene is never just about hygiene. It's about what we value, what we fear, what we share. It's about the body, yes, but also about the soul, the community, the story we tell about ourselves. The medievals told their story with basins of holy water, with combs and herbs, with prayers and perfumes. We tell ours with soap dispensers, shower gels, and bright white towels. Both are ways of saying, I am here, I am human, I am not just flesh, I am something more. So, did medieval hygiene work? Well, you're here, aren't you? If it had failed completely, the line would have ended long ago. Against lice, against filth, against plagues, against the sheer mess of existence, they managed. They kept going. They passed down their strange tricks, their imperfect routines, their stubborn resilience. And maybe that's enough. As you drift now, perhaps you picture a medieval night, a peasant lying beneath rough wool blankets, smelling faintly of smoke, of herbs, of earth, with clean linen against their skin. Or a monk rising at dawn to wash his hands before prayers. Or a lady pinning a pomander to her gown, hoping the scent will guard her against unseen dangers. They are far away, and yet close. Human, ordinary, fragrant and foul, surviving as best they could. And you, with your fan humming softly, your lights dimmed, your room clean and quiet, you are connected to them by something as simple as water on skin, cloth against body, breath against air. Hygiene is history's most intimate bridge. And now, as you rest, you can cross that bridge and leave behind the noise, the smells, the chaos, knowing that even in the darkest times, people found ways to be clean, to be human, to endure. Sleep well.